Mr. Zach Stein, welcome to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. Or I suppose I should say Dr. Zach Stein.
It's good to be here, Rafe. It's good to see you again.
So you are a doctorate of education from Harvard, I believe, one of the founders of the Civilizational Research Project,
Yep.
Center for World Philosophy and Religion.
Yep.
So the center of your work these days is around extinction risks and global meta-crisis or polycrisis.
Yep.
You've written Education in a Time Between Worlds, which I have here, and I have not finished, but I'll work on it, continue working on it. And you just published a recent book with Mark Gaffney and Ken Wilber.
Yep. Yeah, First Principles and First Values.
First Principles and First Values. So I've been listening to a bunch of your podcasts. We had the opportunity to work together actually at something called the Respond Project at Maple in Vermont back in the summer of 2022, which was a really beautiful time with some really amazing people. I felt a really strong connection and really interesting to get to know you on multiple levels there. And then I wanted to read your book before I interview you, and I just gotten in my way. So I waited 3 years to interview you, but I figured we'd just do it. And I've been listening to a bunch of your podcasts coming up here, and there's a couple themes that really stood out for me as relevant to what I'm thinking about right now. There's two that particularly stuck out for me. One was this issue of transhumanism, right? I think that this is a much bigger player in what's going on in the world right now than people realize. And I don't think most people actually have a grasp of what that means and what's actually being thought and driving what's going on behind the scenes in the tech world. Right. So I think I want to get into that, but I think below that, in some sense, is another thing that you've been talking a lot about, which is value. Right. Right. What does it mean to accept that value is real? And what does it mean that we don't? And so I'm guessing that you've read The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis.
Right. Yeah.
I find it interesting to realize how many of these discussions go back and really were brilliantly argued by the Inklings all these many years ago. So I wanted to just, by reading the beginning of that, right? In the second chapter of the Green Book, C.S. Lewis says, this book, it's just about fundamental literacy, right? The authors claim, when a man says that something is sublime, he appears to be making a remark about a waterfall. Actually, he's not making a remark about a waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime, or I have sublime feelings. To make a claim about, and then he says, the schoolboy who reads this passage in the Green Book will believe two propositions. Firstly, that all sentences containing a predicate of value are statements about the emotional state of the speaker. And secondly, that all such statements are unimportant. And of course, he wrote the book, That Hideous Strength, around these same principles, which is really in many ways an extraordinarily prescient depiction of where the transhumanist mindset takes us. So in your research on this question of value, where would you want to start in saying, okay, maybe Gaius and Titius are wrong?
I think C.S. Lewis is a great place to start. And thank you for having me on your podcast, by the way. It's great to be here. And I'm thrilled that you dove right into the deep end, which is C.S. Lewis's addressing the emergent kind of postmodern pedagogy that was beginning to move through the world, mostly after the Second World War. And incidentally, The Abolition of Man figures prominently in two forthcoming volumes, which David J. Temple is producing, which are called Exit the Silicon Maze. And they are about exactly this issue, which Lewis pointed to, which was the future hidden designers of a scientifically controlled society. So he had B.F. Skinner in his sights and was aware of the genius of Skinner, aware of that enough to take it seriously and start really thinking about what would a future look like if we replaced politics, we got rid of politics, and instead we had a science of behavior control. And part of that would be diffusing the innate contact the human has with reality, and specifically value. So that's why it's brilliant to focus on the grammar school textbook, which, without explicitly doing so, nevertheless inculcates in a hidden way a value relativism and a kind of subjectivism and like relativism with regards to what is beautiful, what is good, what is true. And if you do that, you separate the person from reality, then they're much, much more amenable to living in a Skinner box and not really knowing it or caring. And so, yeah, the place to start with the conversation about value is the pre-existing way that the human nervous system relates to the evolved environment in a way that allows it to survive. So what we call value is actually something that has existed for as long as there's been a universe. We talk about evolving and eternal value. And so that the thing that begins as a single cell organism navigating a sucrose gradient towards more sugar, all the way up through mammalian family behavior and hunting behavior to the human experience of, oh, like I would sacrifice my life for my child. That makes sense, that the intrinsic value of the child, not the instrumental value of the child, of the net economic productivity and consumer choices over the total lifespan of the kid. Is that net beneficial or not to our economic? That's not, if you're thinking that way as a parent. Moloch has you, that you need to be thinking about the intrinsic value and the perception of intrinsic value. And easiest to do with something like a child. Now, when you look at a tree, I think probably you and I, because we value nature so much, and this is what I got from you when we were together in Vermont, can see the tree as intrinsically valuable. And in fact, as having a kind of autonomy and almost this proto-personhood where it should be respected. Yes. And that is not like an idea or an opinion I have. It is almost like a perception that you have. That is an embodied perception. So that's what we call anthro-ontology, which is just to say, like, the human's evolved capacity to know what is true and to perceive what is valuable. Of course, that's the main thing that's being max distorted by advertising and social media and a whole bunch of other things. So even when I say that, people are skeptical that exists. But the more you're able to clarify your desire, and again, this is all from the books that are being produced by David J. Temple, the more you clarify your desire, the more you reveal what's actually valuable. So that's a key lesson in practice, sometimes called purification of the will, but in the Hebrew tradition it's called raison, which means purification of desire, which means what do you really want? Not what you've been told to want, but what you really want / need, right? And then you're in a situation of, oh, that, what you revealed when desire is clarified is intrinsic value. And not culturally relativistic, contrived value conventions, but real living value. We talk of a field of value, which is something we live in and are an expression of this field of value, like a living God. And that's a whole bunch, a lot follows from that way of thinking. It's value realism in a new guise, because what C.S. Lewis got wrong was, of course, his commitment to a kind of pre-modern religiosity. This would be maybe a straw man of Lewis, but I think the reason he wasn't taken as seriously as he should have been was in part because people thought, oh, those pre-modern religious traditions, yeah, they believe in that value is real, but they also believe in this God in the sky and like this foolish stuff. And so modernism and postmodernism kind of destroyed that naive conception that allowed us to just say the child has a soul that is inviolable and is more precious than gold because God says so. Right. Well, you're not allowed to argue that way anymore.
Yeah.
Now we talk about the child as this evolved meat machine that might as well be a monkey that's supposed to be economically productive as part of the industrial system. Right. And then C.S. Lewis, oh my God, give me that old time religion. Right. And what we need is some way to return to value without returning to the pre-modern, because that has been rightfully in many ways critiqued. So the reconstructive project now is one where we pull from those traditions and innovate with those traditions. So that was a way into the conversation a little bit there.
So what I think what I'll pick up on here is, I think the sort of underlying assumptions of nominalism are written into the grammar of our culture in ways that we don't realize. And we often say this, like when you say that, when Gaius and Titius say that you're just saying something about your feelings, or you're only saying something about your feelings, there's so much weight on that just, and we do it all the time, right? Love is just chemicals in the brain. And what I've been thinking about a lot recently is this idea that I've been reading The Blind Spot by Evan Thompson, and this idea of misplaced concreteness, right?
Mm.
That we think because we can abstract out and find and then manipulate reality through something like dopamine, that dopamine is fundamentally more real.
Mm.
But the thing that finds dopamine is something that does not experience dopamine directly. It's something that actually experiences love, right? Love is the thing that we experience that then we attribute to some abstracted thing that we can measure in using scientific tools.
Mm.
And we have this mistake of misplaced concreteness. And so this is very connected for me, and this connects deeply to my work with the body and how we train people with the problem of direct perception versus indirect perception. Because I think what you get with J.J. Gibson is actually a scientific account of philosophical realism and a recentering of the embodied sensual self, right? As we abstracted out physics, we took ourselves out of the picture in some sense, but we don't live in the world that is described by physics. We live in the world that's described by the ecology of surfaces. And so that idea that in order to recover the world that we can actually move through, we have to do all this indirect perception, I think somehow related to how we have decided that values can only live inside our minds, that they cannot be intrinsic to the world that's outside of us. And so the idea that there might actually be something like beauty that is actually an intrinsic quality of reality that is accessible to us directly. We have so much underlying analogical grammar about how we perceive reality that stands in our way of simply making that recognition. But once we step into that recognition and we justify it fully, I actually don't think that we can solve the meta crisis without making that move.
Very well said. The issue of nominalism versus realism is the issue that has been the thorn in the side of modernity and then post-modernity since the get-go. So like I was obsessed at a certain point with Charles Sanders Peirce, who was the founder of American pragmatism. And this was his issue since he was like 12. After he read Kant, it was like, wait a second, are the things in the world there or not? And modernity, it doesn't really matter because we're making more commodities and accomplishing experimental conditions that show kind of a reliable differential responsiveness. And so they're not super concerned about this deeper ontological question. They become agnostic about it. That's why we speak, David J. Temple speaks of the common sense, sacred axioms of value of modernity, where there was a kind of consensus that these truths are self-evident. That's super not a good argument. I mean, I love the Constitution, but I'm saying from the perspective of the church fathers and Aristotle and other people, the idea that the whole foundation of your society is a set of self-evident truths is quite a bold claim that modernity is able to make, because there's this sense that we're done fighting about stupid metaphysical stuff. Let's not kill each other over like whether the wafer is the body of Christ and like the angels. And let's not do that. Let's agree that treat people with dignity and pursue liberty and freedom and this kind of stuff. So they went agnostic, which allowed science to go crazy, and we start dissecting bodies and doing all of this stuff as a result of that. Like, from one perspective, the tradition speaks of a heresy that is faith. So this commitment to the secular and divesting from metaphysical commitment allowed for this crazy spiraling of scientific and technological inquiry. And then now we're into the for better and for worse bit. And the for worse bit was that we were running off of a loan of social capital that we took from pre-modernity. And slowly, especially with post-modernity, that we were calling in that loan. Well, is it really true that people should be respected? Is it really true that democracy is important? Is it like, let's cash those loans, which the society is running? So now we're pretty screwed, because now we're at the point where you're describing, which is that all of the most fundamental questions that aren't engineering questions are believed to be arbitrary, are believed to be topics about which you can't have real learning processes, because there's no reality that can correct your misunderstanding. There is only social convention that can punish or not punish you. That's a very postmodern view, and it's incorrect, but very persuasive. And it leads to a sense that our most important commitments, which are value commitments, are just up to us, are not really encoded in cosmos. That the thing that I'm pursuing in perpetuating a civilization that I value, let's say, is not somehow valued by the universe, is not how any civilization has ever run. All civilizations have run on the idea that the thing we're doing here in this civilization is somehow supposed to be happening because of how the universe works. And to run a civilization on basically nihilism, relativism, doesn't really work.
It's falling apart.
It's hard, right? And the default thing is to go back to nationalism / pre-modern. The necessary move, as you're saying, to resolve the meta crisis is to move towards a reconstructive project where we find a way to have value realism again, which is an extremely important issue. So
what I've been interacting recently with, probably a bad idea, but I've been invited to a bunch of like meta-modernism groups on Facebook. I tip my head into those.
Facebook's already a right idea, but
Yeah.
continue.
And so I didn't really go out of my way to start studying meta-modernism, very integral, right? Like people picked up my work and said, hey, this looks like meta-modernism, right? You want to come to this conversation. My sort of grounding in all of this is really twofold. It's John Vervaeke and Jordan Peterson, right? Those are the two. And then through John and Jordan, I access you, and I access Jordan Hall. And then, of course, going back, Jean Piaget and Jacques Panksepp, David Abram, Merleau-Ponty, et cetera. The ladder I go up is there. And so when I look at metamodernism, especially right now, I think there's a huge reactive fear that's happening because of the election of Donald Trump. And I think what I see is that it looks a lot like most people seem to be operating from axiomatic frames that actually derive from postmodernism and haven't really realized how unrooted from reality a lot of those things are.
Yeah. I mean, please continue.
Yeah. And part of that is like this hard reaction against any assertion of the potential value of tradition and of things like nationalism. My sense is that I've started to use the word meta-traditional or neo-traditional to think about people like Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pajot, like Mary Harrington. And I think in certain ways, this neo-traditionalism is simply better grounded in reality, right? Because it's rejected post-modernity enough to go back and say, hey, what's the ground reality underneath these claims? And one of those is, for me, is a kind of, I was talking to my wife about this the other day, of something like we can't return to the ethnic nationalism of modernity, which it's this weird simplification of value, of sacred value, to being essentially the Nazis in some sense assert that the sacred value is the propagation of the Aryan race. Right? If we go back to Lewis and you read the end of Out of the Silent Planet, where Weston is speaking to the Oyarsa of Mars, and he's talking about how the highest value that he can conceive is just that the human species should continue. And then everything else is downstream. He'll happily destroy everything just so the human species can continue. Every other thinking thing is subservient to that. And we could say that, okay, that's the ethno-nationalism of Nazism just applied to human beings. And when I see someone like Elon Musk and his quest to get us to Mars and escape to outer space, like, I think that's Weston, right? Elon Musk is a character out of a C.S. Lewis novel. But the flip side of the postmodern thing is this desire to erase all structuring to love. No ordo amoris, right? And I think that we need I think it is against human nature, actually, to not invite in a love of particularism, of localism. I find it very strange that people can be hyper concerned about how local their tomatoes are and not consider it important that a culture that they live in has some continuity. Or the opposite, that someone can be hyper concerned about the localism of their neighbors and think that shopping at Walmart is completely appropriate. So I see a necessity to reintegrate the drives that brought us to nationalism, not as our highest value, but as something within the set of values. What do you make of that?
A few things. I would say the transhumanism discussion becomes relevant here as we talk about what's unfolding geopolitically with transitions of power. And one of the things that the transhumanists have going for them is the idea that the actions of humans have cosmic significance, which is a religious idea. Like their basic metaphysic is that evolution boots biological life. Biological life boots silicon. Silicon destroys biological life. We upload into silicon, and that is how nature intends it. And this is where they talk out of both sides of their mouths. But in a sense, what they're saying is, what we're doing now with this rapid technological accelerationism around artificial intelligence and building trillion-dollar computers, what we're doing there is preparing the way for evolution to take its next step. This would be like, some people really say this openly.
Yeah.
Other people, it's hard to know how much they believe it. And so you have to look at thinkers like Nick Land, who is perfectly comfortable returning to metaphysics and realism. It's just a kind of dark enlightenment, as he would characterize it. And certainly happy returning to nationalism as well, but in the context of a almost like apocalyptic endgame of late capitalist accelerationism towards something like a future that we can't understand because it's so technologically different from this future. It would be this notion of singularity. And so, one sense of neo-traditionalism, which we would agree with in our terms of our, what we want to call an evolving perennialism.
Yeah.
Which is the ability to reclaim some of what is being lost or destroyed in the great religious traditions and the notions of the polity and governance and other things that emerged from those traditions, which is to say, what we've known about what it means to be human to this point. Arguing in favor that there are truths still to be preserved there. And in fact, that is where we can, in some sense, with the right reconstructive work, create a new edifice that can resist the abolition of man, can resist the transhumanist play for all of the marbles. Otherwise, we don't know what to say to them. Because we're like, oh no, stop, the human is intrinsically valuable. And they're like, no, the human is an evolved meat machine from a random universe in which there is no value. We're choosing to take a stand for the perpetuation of this consciousness, no matter what the instantiation. So we're actually doing more than you to preserve value of the universe by arranging for human immortality and transplanetary perpetuation of the species. To which the response is, you know what, that like you, it's not clear like what the articulate response is from the normal culture. If it's that old time religion, they're way past that. That argument's not going to work on them. If it's postmodern or common sense sacred axiom, which is to say, because we're protecting liberal democracy and individualism, that ship sailed also. So the argument that's going to work against the transhumanists remains to be found, I think. This would be my view. And it's worth noting that they're a class that is conspiring together, meaning that they don't all like one another, but they are nevertheless have class interests. And so they are cooperating. So we're seeing contra Turchin inter-elite cooperation in some of the most important sectors. Of course, there's
I'll just double click here real quickly so that people know what you're speaking to. Peter Turchin is an author who lays out how conflicts develop within societies and inter-elite conflicts. So, and I think that's a very interesting question right now, because so I've been, let's say, it might be interesting to dig into why this is particularly emotionally relevant to me, given my upbringing, but I've been very perturbed by wokeness. I do not like wokeness. I do not like the axiomatic set of wokeness, and it's something that I've experienced. I essentially left my anthropology degree with 3 credits left to graduate in 2001 because of the impact of postmodernism on anthropology, and then I've watched that same thing propagate through our culture. So I've been very much, we have to address this stuff, how destructive it is. From gender ideology to the DEI stuff to the cancel culture, all of it. And then now we have the rise of this new populist right. And the question is like, what actually is it, right? I don't know exactly what it is. And increasingly, my sense is that what we're seeing with all the stuff that's coming out about the NGOs and USAID is how much wokeness is astroturfed, right? It's built into a whole institutional structure. But I keep coming back to this idea that maybe I've been, in some sense, shooting at the wrong target. Like wokeness is not good, but ultimately it's actually it almost feels like it's a mask. That it's something that's propagated in the sort of middle layer of the professional managerial class, while the actual power players are playing at the level of transhumanism, which isn't being taught in academia, isn't being propagated, isn't being forced down people's throats, but is actually what is driving the most important decision-making processes that are happening and the sort of inter-elite wars that are happening. I see people think Elon Musk is a fascist Nazi, and I'm like, I don't think he is. I think he's happy to play with that meme sphere in order to gain power. And he's angry at how wokeness played out in his own life. But ultimately, his philosophical grounding to me seems to be this transhumanist, right? We're going to space. And I think it's ultimately shared with Sam Altman and Bill Gates and everybody else. It's just about who controls and what values they put into it. They all want to be the grand conditioner of humanity in the end of the day.
I mean, a few things to say there. One is that very hard to know what's going on in the contemporary information environment. And so prior to woke and MAGA is the information ecosystem of digital media, social media, And so that for me always complicates the point. So like with the USAID thing, I don't know what I legitimately don't know. And so, and when I talk to people who are in a position to know, they're also much less sure of what's happening than the people who are getting it from X or Facebook or CNN. So I think the hard thing in the conversation now is to know what to say at all. And that is a very peculiar position to be put in. And because we're forced to have to say something, we end up saying stuff without really knowing. And so that's where I feel about, unfortunately, a lot of the most important things that are occurring now. And I think that's by design. So there's a small number of things that I know pretty well and can speak to. But at that level of broad, sweeping, nation scale, like highly propagandized information sphere, I often wonder a lot about what they want us to be talking about. Who they are, I'm not. That's not like some specific conspiracy, but the idea being like, why are we talking about certain things like USAID and not other things? Well, it's because of what's in our newsfeed. What's in our newsfeed? Why is it in our newsfeed? So this is where, like, prior to the political conversation, you have to have this meta-political conversation about the hidden curriculum within the information environment, which is a curriculum towards schismogenesis and polarization, towards speech that alienates some subclass necessarily, as opposed to speech that would try to get everyone to come to some broader understanding of shared concern. And so the state of the culture is one where there is lessening inter-elite competition among the technologists, growing competition against that class by other elites, which is leading to a astroturfed polarization and increase in agitation across the board. And so you're right to see woke as a mask, but there are many masks right now that are being worn by people who put on identities that are being crafted for them by the social media printer. And so this was back in the COVID days when we did the Consilience papers. A lot of that writing is still, I think, relevant, and even more relevant now given the acceleration of the news cycle, the intentional acceleration of the news cycle, with all of the flood of activities, which makes it even harder to know what is important, what's not important, who actually is a distraction, who's actually doing something, like what is done just to waste time of the enemy, what is done actually as a move that will work. So there's a bunch of complexity in the field.
I guess what comes up for me is, historically, I'm an emergentist, right? Like I tend to think that we emphasize top down, right? We look at a problem and we think it's because of some specific group of them that's making it happen. Whereas a lot of times it's us, actually, in some sense, right? People are like, oh, them. And it's, well, why do movies suck right now? Because people buy tickets to shitty movies, right? There's other reasons. But part of it is that the consumer was willing to buy the 18th Marvel movie. And so the studios were like, okay, well, we're going to do a giant skybeam and an army of faceless minions, and we're going to do it exactly like we've been doing it because you keep giving us billions of dollars to do it. So there's a bottom up layer. And one of the things that I've thought about a lot, or I've been interested in, is I kind of watched the meme set that dominates wokeness go from, there's a lot of it in anthropology by 2001 school, right? A lot of these ideas, a lot of this just complete relativism, anti-realism, and just anti-Westernism is all really baked in. But it's not quite so psychologically unhealthy as the later versions. And I remember first encountering like the hysterical aspect of this on LiveJournal in the mid-aughts. And then I started to get wind of these sort of mobbing behaviors, and everything's like about oppression all the time through Tumblr. And I remember when Tumblr banned pornography, and there was a massive sort of drop in the usage of Tumblr, and all of those people migrated over to Twitter. And when they hit Twitter, it was like the woke meme sphere just exploded. But at the same time that was happening, the Obama administration which Obama was elected with the energy of Occupy Wall Street and the anti-war movement. So it was about transparency. He was coming in to bring transparency. He was coming in to heal the racial rifts in our society. He was coming to return us to economic populism and to take us out of all of this foreign adventurism. And then he bailed out the banks, didn't do anything for the Main Street, kept Guantanamo Bay open, kept us in all of our foreign wars. And then all of a sudden the New York Times is talking about Emmett Till all the time and about every potential racial incitation and gender and sex. And so there's a way in which it looks like you had an emergent upwelling of this kind of oppression Olympics orientation that then was picked up at the highest level and propagated out through all of our mainstream media. And now what it looks like to me is that the nascent populist right is bizarrely influenced by the meme set that was developed by 4chan like 15 years ago. And so like Jordan Peterson said, in 2018, he said, we live in a 13-year-old girl's or 15-year-old girl's fantasy, right? Because it was basically Tumblr fandoms that created the social grammar that all of a sudden we were living within. And I have this fear that all of a sudden we're not living the 14-year-old girl's fantasy or 15-year-old girl's fantasy. Now we live in the 15-year-old boy's fantasy of reality that was created on 4chan. It's not a good thing, but this relationship between the emergent and then how it's picked up, because if you think about Musk as a hyper agent and the fact that he's tweeting out memes that are coming out of accounts that started as 4chan accounts 60 times a day. Like, it's a very strange world, the way that these emergent and top-down layers are playing together.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, in the Consilience papers, we've got this one where we lay out this taxonomy of different forms of propaganda. And you definitely have what's called horizontal propaganda, which is exactly as you're describing. It's created by people, and they're often given concepts and frameworks and then run with it and then innovate. And a lot of what occurred in what was called the alt-right was horizontal propaganda, people of their own initiative in an emergent way, bringing propaganda to the table. And so that becomes a pretty interesting question as the media evolves, is the emergence of new forms of coercive and manipulative speech, and then the saturation of bad faith communication throughout all of our things. And like thought terminating cliches in particular are the classic thing. So like oppression Olympics is an example of one. You probably didn't make that up. You got that from somewhere. And the oppression Olympics thing is just like schismogenic, and meaning it creates a reaction in people and also stops you from thinking about all the varieties of different ways that oppression is actually discussed. And so yeah, it's an interesting quagmire. And the academic postmodernism is actually pretty intense and awesome in some contexts, like Foucault's analysis of insane asylums is worth reading as good sociology. Now, is it good epistemology and ultimately good philosophy? No, right? Because it's like the end of this kind of like late modern, beginning of this postmodern thing. But is it an important indictment of an extremely fucked up institution? Yes. Yeah. And so I think that's where you have to think about how to tease apart the critical moment that is, for example, the private prison industry in the United States. Not a good thing. How do we create context where we can speak against that? What's the theory that we use to expose that as bad? If we make it impossible to do that, because we go anti-woke instead of going post-woke, meaning we acquire none of the good stuff over there, which we ought to go looking for and bring along and up and into whatever this thing is we're trying to create. And so, yeah, I want to somehow preserve the critical moment that allows us to truly try to make more humane institutions, but jettison all of the psych warfare and histrionic, basically what I would describe as semi-pathological behavior that has been introduced by it, in some sense as a reaction to and a traumatization from some of the theory that revealed just how bad things have been made by modernity. And I think that's the issue. So in a sense, there's like an alignment with woke and the traditional in the condemnation of the radically modern and the radically capitalist. Say that. Now the woke is crypto-normative. They're against things, but they don't necessarily stand for things. But there is, in a sense, a stand together against this extractive capitalism that is willing to just chew humans up and spit them out. And so that's, I think, an interesting thing to note is that critical discourse, the root and the ability to stand anywhere in a critical discourse in a society that's becoming massively complex is an open question. So that's why I prefer to think of a model like a post-woke rather than anti-woke, because then it allows us to, oh shit, that's actually a very important point to bring over here. And there's other things also in terms of, just like with the traditional stuff, I would say the evolving perennialism is not a return, it's a reconstruction. So yeah, but again, so much of this is a result of the technological and communications infrastructures rapidly accelerating. So like the intensity of the cultural antagonism, the complexity of the mimetic, and the overall sense-making kind of crisis that's induced by that much information is super bad for the human nervous system. There's nothing like it in the evolving part. Like you're dealing with 75 people or something, like a bunch of gossip you're not dealing with, and fear of the gods and like getting killed and stuff. But this is a whole other type of chronic stress and confusion and induced stress, meaning like the algorithm is inducing stress to have you returning to it to potentially relieve it. And so like the neurochemical amygdala like hack of the social media thing is what allows us to have political preferences and ideas made a part of our personality without our consent, meaning without us really having thought it through. And that's something that it's literally designed to do because it's an advertising platform. So how do you sell to the people who invested in advertising the platform? You say, well, we can make people do stuff that they wouldn't otherwise do. So invest in us as a advertising platform. So they're in the business of limbically hijacking, and that deeper than that, just for profit, is actually, no, they're getting you to have personalities and have beliefs and have a repertoire of concepts and thought terminating cliches and other things that now it's just a part of you. And you're like, how did I get that? I don't even remember it. And so that's it. I don't know exactly what to do about that. So there's like it seems like there's no slowing down in terms of the complexity of the information environment and the capture of the information. So I'm awaiting the emergence of some type of meta, not like the company meta, but like a superordinate application that allows you to, disconnect and detox from the overwhelming stream and somehow bring to you a limited number of things that are actually important and significant for you. And that would be a real thing, like local news, for example. To your point, like what's going on in the local community, as opposed to all this crazy global stuff that I know I don't really know enough about to have a strong opinion on. But what they're going to do with that bridge, or how they're thinking about taxing the schools and that kind of stuff, like where's the news outlets for that, and what percentage of that are you seeing, which is relevant to you in terms of being a mile away or 2 miles away, as opposed to the percentage of news you're seeing about stuff that's thousands and thousands of miles away, that is part of a conflict, that part of that conflict is propaganda, psychological warfare operations. So it's kind of like, how much do you attend to that thing, knowing that you're being manipulated and won't know the truth about it, as opposed to attending something in your local news where you could go to the town, you could go there, look at that bridge and think about who the contractors are going to be and what the materials are going to be and the environmental impacts and think about all that stuff. But that's way less fun than arguing with people on social media about shit you don't know stuff about. Because then you have to go over there and you have to talk to people who know shit about bridges. And you're like, oh, right.
It also takes you out of the propositional, right?
Exactly. It takes you out of the propositional.
Once you, right. And this is one of my big, if we go back to the point I was making about localism, right? Or particularism. I think that a lot of one of the downstream effects of the tyranny of the propositional is this sort of illusion that we have a sort of equivalent power to impact things through this entire network where we don't understand our constraints well. And this is why, like, I brought up the concept of ordo amoris, right? Like the order of loves. The order of loves is an important thing that we need to reintegrate as we go post-woke, not because it is transcendently, metaphysically appropriate for me to love my child more than so. My child does not deserve love more than a Palestinian child. But I am empowered to love my child better than a Palestinian child. I am empowered to love my neighbor's children better. And I saw a quote from Augustine about that, right? By lot, we end up being in a position to operationalize the mode of love best for some set of people. And so within Christianity, there is a universalizing tendency, because we can see the claim is that we are all equally images of the divine, and therefore we equally deserve care and we equally deserve everything. And I think woke morality is downstream of that. It is an extension of Christianity. I like Tom Holland's argument here. So what I've been playing with in my mind is this idea. I think that Lewis says something else that I really like. He talked about this idea of the sternness and tenderness of love. And I've been playing a lot with the idea that each pole, the sternness and the tenderness, can inherently incentivize us to let go of the other side, which is to say that if I have to deliver a difficult message or I have to discipline someone, the degree to which my heart is open to them makes my disciplining of them more painful.
Totally.
And reciprocally, the more that I open my heart and try to love, the more that I find it difficult to say that, hey, you've actually done something wrong, or you need to change your behavior. Right? Yes. And so what I see is that there are many people who invest themselves, say, in loving Palestinians or in loving Israelis. And then they want to apply all of their sternness to whichever is the opposite side for them and all of their tenderness to whichever is the side for them. So they'll forgive everything, right? People who are like, no, there were no rapes on October 7th. That didn't happen. So I watched the video. Like I saw the young women with blood in their pants as they're being dragged away. No, it's all a psyop, right? And it's because they're so incentivized to want to love the suffering people who are a suffering people that they cannot hold them accountable for their actions. And you could reverse the story and say it about people who are in support of Israel, who want to dehumanize them and have no tenderness for the people of Gaza, right? So I pray every night, right? Let me stand in the painful place between the sternness and tenderness of love. And then I pray, okay, where can I do that? I do it for me first. Hold myself to that standard, and then with my wife, and then with my children, and then extending out. And I don't know, I completely lost the plot of what I was trying to say, but I think that we have to recognize how limited we are when we actually operate in the procedural, perspectival, and participatory realms of nature. Mm-hmm. And that in that there is actually painful work that can be really done that has real impact, that we can play with a facsimile, a shadow play that feels satisfying but doesn't actually take us anywhere.
I mean, this is very profound. I love that polarity. And I think a couple of things are worth saying here. Before you do sense making, you should just sense, right? And so if there's a war happening, the first thing you do is sense into the war, which would mean all sides and the pain of all sides and the righteousness of all sides, and just feeling into it without trying to make sense of what's happening, just like feeling it, right? And this would be true of almost anything you're trying to make sense of. You begin with the, let's say, embodied right hemisphere. If I can put it in like McGilchrist terms, you begin with it. Then you start to think about what words to say and what the argument is and the history, right? And then you return to the right hemisphere. And so what you're describing here is this kind of dance between the really complex sensing and perspective taking that is needed and the difficulty of moving between the propositional.
Sorry, you broke up. What words to say?
And that embodied.
I missed everything. What words to say?
I think this may have broken up there. I'm not sure if it's my
it broke up. I didn't hear anything you said after what words to say.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah. So that's the notion, is that sensing is prior to sense making. And one more thing to say, the thing you said about the priorities in which you can give your love and care, I think is good. And to counteract the abstract universalism that would make you care in an abstract way about everybody. And
I do. I try.
Yeah. And so when you're thinking about like moral development, which is something like that isn't studied as much. You mentioned Jean Piaget. He was one of the classic people who studied moral development. And then his student Lawrence Kohlberg, studied moral development. What's really interesting is that it starts with phenomenology. It starts with what we were talking about at the outset of the perception of something. And then afterwards trying to find language to put on it. But there are perceptions at the highest level, which are perceptions of the universal and the archetypal and the kind of, for lack of a better phrase, like spiritual insights, which would allow you to, not in an abstract way, but in a concrete way, feel or sense the pain of everyone or everything. And so this is a practice in some traditions, which is trying to feel into the pain of the divine that is in exile, that is in matter, that is subject completely to incarnation. And so the kind of bliss crucifixion of the embodied form as a total empathetic God is a foundation for saying things about caring for everyone. But short of that kind of insight into, let's say, the world soul, a lot of universal statements are just beliefs and are contradicted by your actual actions, privilege that people right freaking next to you, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is the point Ken Wilber made very well in the 90s now, of just about the difference between the rhetoric of universal human rights and the profound mystical experience of the world soul that is the foundation of something like an embodied sense of what would be a universal human right. And so that's like a call to a certain type of practice, which is the kind of practice you're recommending, which is when you go into the depths of both sides of all conflicts, right? Go into the depths of both sides of all cultural splits and feel the sadness, grief, brokenness, righteousness, all of that. Then start to piece together something that is a way forward. And usually that will be different as a result of doing that empathetic practice. And it is a practice. It's like reading, I think, or other things where you have to give it time and attention. So the more you're scrolling and moving from minute-long thing to 4-minute-long thing to 30-second thing to 2-second thing to 2-second thing to 2-second thing to minute-long thing, the more you're doing that, the less you're doing the type of embodied reflection that would lead you up into greater empathy, which requires time meditating or in a non-semantic, non-propositional activity, meaning like you're moving body or something where you're not speaking, you're not thinking in language, and just sensing and also processing in a unconscious or preconscious way.
There's two things I wanted to say in response to that. One is, you said that very often claims of universalism are behaviorally contradicted by operating entirely towards the people near to you. But I think it's almost, there's even maybe one step deeper, which is that very often the assertion of moral universalist claims is actually a narcissistic act of piety signaling.
I mean, again, piety signaling happens on all sides.
Sure, of course.
But there's a unique one that it has emerged in the kind of postmodern cultural left, which is that. And it's hard to hold that. And I saw that a lot in the university.
This other thing that I want to say, I think is much more valuable. So look, I've spoken about this a little bit on the podcast, but last year, my wife and I separated. And luckily we're back together. Things are good, but it was a really intense process. And essentially what happened was that I had to first recognize that I'd hurt her very badly. And then I had to try and ask myself, how did I become the person that had hurt her when I knew I loved her? And I've been to therapy for a couple of years at times to deal with the fact that I was sexually abused when I was in my early teens. But I never could actually let go of the sense that I was really fine, that it just didn't actually have that big of an effect on me. And so there was this moment where I was weeping and just absolutely crushed by the grief from my marriage breaking up and what that meant for my children. And it switched, and all of a sudden I was able to tap into the depth of the grief and the pain that came from the sexual abuse that I experienced. It was like the grief channel opened, and I was able to access this grief that I had stuffed very deep down in myself. So I did this really deep work. And one of the things that happened was that Christ appeared for me. He came out and said, okay, I said, I need to feel loved. Christ come and say, okay, you're loved. And it was really profound and scary. And like, it felt like getting like a baby lion getting picked up in the mouth of a big lion. I was like, okay, this is good, but it's terrifying. And I was doing somatic therapy and IFS therapy, and eventually I did MDMA therapy, which just moved this insane amount of stuff through me. And I realized I had processed a lot of the bile and shame and disgust from my sexual abuse, but there was these remaining somatic symptoms of fatigue and gut dysfunction that I realized were really about my relationship with my dad and my inability to grieve my relationship with my dad, who died a couple of years ago. And so I've been working with my somatic therapist on grief. And as my relationship with my wife healed, my access to talking to Christ decreased. Right? It was like, okay, Christ was there for me. And then as I was not in grieving anymore, I was like, okay, he's receded. And for folks who are listening who are skeptical of the metaphysical claims of Christianity, you can conceptualize it as an internal process or supernatural, however you want. For me, it was really incredibly profound and powerful. Now, I had this experience where I was sitting with my somatics teacher, and I was working on letting this grief for my father come up. And he told me, grief is an embodied skill. You have to be able to relax your throat and chest and breath and mouth and let it move through you. And so I drove home and I sat down and I thought about the fact that when I was able to access grief, I could feel close to God. And I remember Jordan Hall, I imagine Jordan, had said that if you want to find God, you have to drink your draft of grief to the dregs. And so I sat there and I started meditating on Christ was willing to die to grieve all of us, to go through every pain that every human being had. He maybe uniquely had this capacity. And that if we want to approach him, we have to go into that. And so I sat, and I'm more on the Israeli side than the Palestinian side in that conflict. But Sinwar had recently died. And I had seen this picture of him with a hole in his head, right, with the concrete dust on it. And so I meditated on that image. And I said, despite his architecting the October 7th attacks, he was a human being who experienced pain and love. And he was motivated by things that I understand. I love my children. I love my people. I love my community. And I would fight to defend my community. And so I tried to meditate on every child that's dying in Gaza and said, okay, even if I agree more with one side of this political conflict, that's still death, that's still pain, that's still all these things. And most of the people are experiencing the actual cost of what's happening. They have no understanding of the full context. They just know that they're being hurt. And so I try to continue this meditation on. I know that I'm not Christ, and it's not my job to have to weep for the entire world, but that in trying to reach towards Christianity for myself, this is what I'm reaching towards, is this capacity to see that universality, but in proper relation now. And that's been the journey that I've been taking. But there's something about the capacity to grieve and to see the universality of grief.
It's beautiful. There's something about what you're saying that is weirdly synchronistic with what I've been talking about in the context of new writing with David J. Temple, where we've been speaking specifically about sacrifice. Sacrifice as a kind of first principle and first value, at least of psychological life, meaning there is a drive to sacrifice, which means there's a drive to grieve loss. And there is a command to sacrifice. And a lot of what you can think about in terms of personality development is, how do you react to the ontological necessity of sacrifice? Meaning, like, the first affront to your primary narcissism of the crib, when you have to distill out of your experience mom or a caregiver who is basically, now you realize, the one giving you everything, as opposed to the experience of it just shows up, right? So the very first self-other distinction is a sacrifice of this profound primary narcissism. And then every move up the kind of attachment and developmental thing is another type of sacrifice. And so the deeper the bond with somebody, the more there is sacrifice. And the more you grieve and put yourself in a position to grieve, right? So insofar as you truly love, the loss of the love object means you truly grieve. And grieving is a type of, I would argue, biological process, related also to just trauma release process, like shaking and other things that the body just does naturally, that other mammals do instinctually, which our education and upbringing repress. Meaning that for all of evolved environment for the human, you lost relatives tragically, violently, right in front of you, eaten by a bear or killed by another tribe. And so the loss of love objects is built into our nervous system in a very profound way, and it's grief. And so your somatic therapist is right. It's like a very specific physiological state, which, if you have not done it and not seen people do it, is you need help grieving. Often people need help grieving, especially if they're socialized or had been in environments where it wasn't appropriate to show that kind of full release of yourself. And so that's very profound, brother. I'm very happy that you've been doing that work. And also just the psychological kind of like depth of grief as a need. Again, like we value grief. Like, even though it's terrible, if I had a close friend and something happened and we weren't friends again and they were not grieving the loss of the friendship, we value that idea that there's enough love that there will be profound grief. And then the faith is that grief will not kill you. That's the faith that's needed, because the experience of actual grief. And this is one way to define like the actual tragic, is that your existing personality system cannot maintain its sense of itself in the world because this has happened. Right. And so then your personality, for a time when you are in grief, your personality literally disorganizes, and you are, in a sense, free, but you're overwhelmed by pain and grief. And that's why you don't want to go there, because there's a fear that you will not reconstitute.
I was working at home about that literally last night.
And it's in those states that you have these altered archetypal visitations, if you will. I don't know, maybe I'll follow you in the metaphysical agnosticism, but it's universally agreed that, yeah, in the tragedy, the personality shatters. Some other organizing entity comes in. And yeah, that's real process. And also, like, culturally used to be more available as an option for dealing with life. And now is something that, like, you have to get lucky to stumble into somatic body worker and all of this stuff to be able to, like, do that. And so it's
last, right? Because
you're, I mean, we're to be even in a podcast situation is to be beautifully blessed. So, please.
My dad died in I had such a surprise, absurd set of events. I was interviewed by Jordan Peterson on February 23rd, I think, of 2023. So that's peak of professional career, right? 500,000 people watched that interview. That Monday, Beth asked for a separation. So that time we're only separated for 6 weeks. Literally, as we're getting back together, my dad has a cancerous lesion on his femur that causes his femur to break apart when he's running to put out a car fire in one of his vehicles. So now we know he's going to die. So that July, on the first day of Return to the Source, our big summer seminar, my dad has a massive heart attack and passes away. And then essentially Beth and I managed to string things along until the end of December, and then she requests a separation again. So I'm in the process of that. And so I had been listening to John Vervaeke, our mutual dear friend, a lot. And he had been talking about internal family systems therapy, somatic therapy, and MDMA. And so I called him and said, hey, I need to do this healing work because I'm not safe for my wife emotionally. And I need her to know that she'll never feel that way again so that she can come back to me. And he's, yep, that's the thing that you're going to do. Like you got it right. And then I had a dear friend and student who had been counseling me for free, who took on the IFS work and did it 6 days a week. And then another friend who turned me on to the best somatic therapist here. And then my personal therapist hooked me up with the MDMA therapy. I was just incredibly blessed to be able to be given this gift of processing. And when I did the MDMA therapy, I was warned that you might have tremors when you do MDMA therapy. Totally. About 3% of people apparently experience tremors. The therapists said they had never seen anybody who reacted as strongly as I did, that I literally like tremor hard and screamed and cursed for 4 hours.
That sounded all right. And yeah, to me, if you're really processing trauma in a therapeutic process, you're going to be shaking.
Yeah, I was shaking insanely hard. And I look back on it, for the first 2 hours, it was nonverbal, right? And then all the stories started to come. This is what was happening, right? And it was like literally like pushing the person who sexually abused me away and saying, no, don't touch me. And this is what's happening when you touch me. And so I thought about it afterwards, and it was like, it felt like what MDMA did was it invited Christ into me so that he could hold my hand while I walked through my own personal hell. And that hell was the only way that I was going to be able to process what needed to be processed. I had to go through it. There's no way to get away from it. There's only going through it. And then you just need the power of compassion and love to hold you while you're in that place. And that was what it did for me. And it wasn't just the MDMA, it was the therapist who worked with me and set me up and created the setting, and everything else that came along with it. And it was John and all my dear friends. And my wife, who even though she was pushing me away and separating from me, she was still loving me and like concerned about me through the entire thing. So, yeah, but I think that our culture, I really agree with you with the sense of everything's about trauma right now. And it's every bad thing is explained by trauma. And it's just one line back of trauma. And it's like that monocausal theory just doesn't work. I mean, processing my trauma has been the key to my healing. It's showing up. And now my wife and I have never been happier 21 years into our relationship after breaking up twice. Is because we're both doing the trauma work. But I have this thing that's, of course, trauma was habitual in that ancestral environment. It's not so much that we're traumatized; it's that we don't know what to do with it. It's that we don't.
It's it's one very compassionate way to read a lot of what happens in some of the woke culture is that it's actually the inability to really process the trauma and the demand to have the right to process the trauma without any space for it. And as I was saying, like the evolved environment, like trauma, like I remember once seeing a chipmunk partially eaten by a snake, and then I came up and the snake dropped it and ran. The chipmunk was almost dead, but wasn't dead. It was actually fine. And for about 3 minutes, it just freaking sat there and shook its, and then it ran off. And I presume it didn't have lingering PTSD that it had to process. It had just literally released whatever that is that does that. And that's, of course, not an experimental situation. And I'm not claiming any scientific thing there, but there is something about the nervous system wanting to do that, able to do that, the culture being like, no, creating. Inhibit is way worse than letting. But again, given what you expressed, the number of people who can like witness that type of therapeutic expression is small. So there's the both. Do I have the courage to let myself truly grieve? And then do I have the courage to witness people truly grieving? These things are related. And so, without a broader framework of value, it's very hard to hold people who are deeply grieving. So like, how do you hold someone deeply grieving when you're a scientific materialist relativist? It doesn't really matter that much. Why are you crying? You're just a meat machine without free will. Why are you so upset about what's happening in the universe? That does not work, believe me. And so there's this deep connection between the ability to witness and process grief and the earlier part of our conversation, which is what do we really value here? And can we console someone? Do we have the languages of deep consolation for people when they're in those states of grief? Otherwise, you won't have the courage to go there because no one can even talk to you. No one has anything to say. And that's super lonely. And that's why Christ would come and help you because
there was a big political controversy a few years ago. I don't need to get into the specific one, but I was really mad about how all the people around me were responding. And I had this like really strong realization that I couldn't speak out about it in a way that would be compelling to anybody, that I just wasn't in a position to offer an opinion and have it land with anybody meaningful at the time. It was very frustrating. And I went and I sat down in the woods and I meditated. And as I was meditating, I had a vision of two fires moving through a forest. One fire was in a healthy forest that had fire moving through it regularly. And one was in a forest that had never been allowed to burn. And so the fire burns off the dead wood and immediately the green pops up. And in the second, the fire burns everything and it's just destroyed. And I was like, oh, this thing, which I disagree with so much and I think is so intellectually unfounded and everything else, fundamentally, it's an expression of grief. And yes, it's going to burn the dead wood, but we have to do the grief work. I don't know how I get to the point where I can help people actually grieve it. But telling people that their anger is inappropriately focused right here is not going to work. Right. Because there's a real meaningful grief that's underneath the anger. And that there's a right way to meet it. And even though it's not being met right now correctly, there is a right way to meet it. And I wasn't ready to meet it at that stage. I don't know if I am now, but it was a profound experience. I had a similar experience with an animal too, but I'll leave that story for another time. But what I wanted to say,
just a couple of minutes, sadly,
I'd like to connect here at the end. Fundamentally, I think that in a culture that does not have cultivated grief capacity, that does not have the embodied skill of grief, that our inherent tendency is a kind of disassociative tendency. And I think that the underlying motivational structure behind transhumanism is something like a dissociative tendency away from the pain of being.
And I would say that's a good way. If you've read Nick Bostrom or any of the kind of more serious philosophers who would claim to be transhumanists, most of their arguments seem like very early childhood arguments against the idea that sickness, pain, death, any of that should exist. None of that should exist is their basic view. They're going to re-engineer the brain to erase traumatic memories. They're going to upload consciousness and solve death. Mostly, I would argue, as you're saying, to avoid grief, because they believe they think it's a bug rather than a feature of life. Whereas we're saying grief/tragedy is actually a feature, not a bug of life. And removing it, like removing death, would be anti-life, weirdly enough. Stopping, if you think about a forest, like your metaphor is great, death is a part of what allows the forest to regenerate, right? And so similarly, grief is like personological regeneration, I would say, really profound grief. And so removing is insane, actually, and very immature, but it does characterize transhumanism as a movement at its extremes, which would be the live forever, never get sick, cure death, maybe. So I would agree. I would agree. And then this question of, is the way to solve transhumanism actually not to argue with them in philosophy, but actually to find a way to engage them in the practices that would reveal to them the beauty of the grief, right?
How do we bring people? The question for me is, how do we bring people back to the body at the deepest layer? The other passage that's been sticking in my head the whole time that we've been talking is in The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis says the domination, man's dominion over nature is the dominion of some men over other men. Who will be the grand conditioners? And there's this beautiful book that nobody knows about called Reshaping Physical Education by Margareta Stryker.
Cool.
And she talks about the rise of the new gymnastics. This is before the Second World War, and how the old gymnastics had all come out of the time of man's dominion over nature, because we had understood a few of the physical laws that were available to us. And so we had become hubristic in our understanding of things, thought that we could dictate to the body. But that the real center of education was in accepting the nature of the body and trying to align ourselves with it. I'm paraphrasing now, but that was the center, not of just the physical side of our education, but of all education, because all education is applied biology. And maybe that's where we should pick up our next conversation, because I know
I'd love to do that. And I fundamentally agree. Again, Piaget would say that, Steiner would say that, in terms of the primacy of the body and actually the form and geometry of the body, and its possible movements and other things being foundational even for intellectual development. So that would be a great conversation. But unfortunately, I gotta go. It was great to talk, Rafe. I really appreciate it.
It was amazing. Thanks for navigating my anti-wokes phase with me there and getting into the deeper meat with me. Appreciate you very much, Zach.
It's so good, man. Yeah. I'll find you later, I'm sure.
Yeah, sounds good. Bye.